The Alpha King of Thornwood had survived brutal wars and ruthless assassins, but tonight, the most feared man in the realm was collapsing in a freezing castle corridor, entirely at the mercy of a 7-year-old girl. He thought his body was finally giving out, but when her tiny voice echoed through the shadows, calmly stating he wasn't tired, but drugged, the king realized his true enemies were hiding inside his own home. He could silence the child who had just uncovered his court's deadliest secret, or he could trust the lowly laundry maid rushing to his side. What this ruthless king did next shocked the entire kingdom. The corridor was cold, the way old stone corridors always are when the fire in the braziers has burned low. Margaret, Maggie, to everyone who knew her, had been supposed to stay in the laundry room with the other children of the household staff. But the laundry room was warm and loud and smelled of lye, and Maggie had wanted to see the hunting dogs in the kennel yard one more time before the frost came down hard. She had slipped out through the servants' door, her small bare feet padding on the flagstones, and that was how she found herself in the west corridor at an hour when children should have been asleep. She heard him before she saw him, a heavy, dragging step, the kind that made her think of her grandfather's old mare when it had gone lame. Then a low, rough sound that was halfway between a breath and a groan. Maggie pressed herself back against the wall, because Mama had taught her that you do not walk up to a lord in a castle. Not ever. Not even if he looks like he needs help. But the sound came again, and this time it was followed by a thud, as if something, or someone, had stumbled against the stone. She peered around the corner. The man was tall, taller than any man she had ever seen up close, with dark hair and a gray cloak that hung crooked from one shoulder. He was leaning against the wall with one hand braced flat against the cold stone, and in the other hand he held a cup, a silver cup, the kind with a heavy base that the steward liked to polish. His head was bowed, and his shoulders moved with a breathing that did not sound right. Maggie watched for a long moment. Then she did what her mother would have called a very foolish thing. She stepped out from behind the corner and walked toward him, her bare feet making soft sounds on the stone. She stopped a few paces away, tilting her head up. The man's head lifted slowly, and she saw his eyes, gray like the winter sky, but blurred at the edges, as if he were looking at her through water. "You're not tired, sir," Maggie said. Her voice was small but steady. "You're drugged." The word hung in the cold air. The man blinked at her, slow and heavy, his brow furrowing. He tried to straighten and swayed. The silver cup slipped from his fingers, clattering against the stone, and a thin splash of dark wine spilled across the floor. He looked at the cup, then back at her, and there was something in his gray eyes that was not quite anger, not quite fear. It was confusion, and beneath it a flicker of something old and wounded. "Little girl," he said, and his voice was rough, a smith's voice, made for commanding, not for whispering. "What did you say?" "You're drugged," Maggie repeated. She did not step closer, but she did not step back either. "I've seen it before. Grandfather's neighbor drank bad water once, and he walked like that and talked like that. And the healer said he was drugged, not drunk." "You're not drunk, sir. You're drugged." The man stared at her. For a long, terrible moment she thought he might be angry. His jaw tightened, and his hand, which had been braced against the wall, curled into a fist. But then his knees buckled, and he went down hard, one knee striking the stone with a sound that made Maggie flinch. He caught himself with both hands, breathing hard, and his head hung low between his shoulders. Maggie turned and ran. Not away, she ran back the way she had come, through the servants' door, down the narrow stone steps, into the warm steam of the laundry room, where her mother was folding linen with the other women. She grabbed her mother's hand and tugged, hard. Thinka said. "Mama, the gray-eyed man in the west corridor. He's sick, he's drugged, like grandfather's neighbor. Come now, Mama, come now." Claire looked down at her daughter, and something in the child's face made her set down the linen without a word. She wiped her hands on her apron, nodded to the other women, and followed Maggie out into the cold, her heart already quickening. She did not ask why Maggie had been wandering the corridors. There would be time for that later. They found him still on the floor, half collapsed against the wall, the silver cup lying on its side a few feet away. Claire recognized him at once. The gray eyes, the scar through his left brow, the tall frame that even now, slumped and weakened, seemed to fill the corridor. She had seen Alfred King Edward of House Thornwood from a distance many times. In the great hall, in the courtyard, always surrounded by guards and advisors, always moving with the deliberate weight of a man who commanded armies. She had never been this close to him. She had never seen him look like this. He raised his head as she approached, and there was a warning in his eyes even now, a wolf's wariness, dulled but not gone. "Your Grace," Claire said quietly, dropping into a low curtsy even as her eyes swept over him, taking in the pallor of his face, the tremor in his hands. "Forgive me. My daughter says you've been given something." He opened his mouth, and for a moment she thought he would order her away, order her to fetch the steward, order her to do anything but stand there looking at him like that. But what came out was not an order. It was a question, rough and almost childlike in its bewilderment. "Who are you?" "Claire, Your Grace. I work in the laundry. This is my daughter, Margaret." She hesitated, then stepped forward to Tharn, her hand reaching out. "You need to stand. You need to get to your chambers, away from the corridor. If someone sees you like this—" "Someone did this," he said, and the words came out thick, slurred at the edges. He looked at the cup on the floor, and his eyes narrowed. "Someone in my own house." "Yes, Your Grace," Claire said, and there was no fear in her voice, only a quiet certainty. "And they will not expect you to be walking to your chambers unaided, so let us help you." He looked at her for a long moment, and then, slowly, he reached out and took her hand. His grip was strong even now, but it shook. Claire pulled him to his feet, and he swayed, and she braced herself against his weight, her small frame taking the strain without complaint. Maggie moved to his other side, and he looked down at her, and something in his face softened, just for an instant. "You're very small," he said, "to know such things. My grandfather," Maggie said, "had an ego who drank bad water. Are you going to be sick, sir?" "Probably," Edward said, and it was almost a laugh, though it came out like a groan. They moved slowly down the corridor, Claire steadying him with one arm, Maggie holding his hand. At the far end of the hall behind a pillar, a shadow shifted, a figure in a steward's dark robe, watching. Claire did not see it. Edward, his head bowed, did not see it either. But the figure remained there, still a stone, until they disappeared around the corner, and then it turned and walked the other way, its footsteps silent on the cold stone. In his chambers, Claire helped him to the bed and eased him down onto the edge of it. He sat there, head in his hands, breathing hard. Claire turned to send Maggie for water, but Maggie was already at the door, already running. The child had good instincts, Claire thought, even if her curiosity would one day be the death of her. Edward lifted his head and looked at Claire with those gray eyes, and for a moment he was not the Alpha King, not the commander of armies, not the Lord of Thornwood. He was just a man who had been poisoned in his own home, who did not know whom to trust. "Why did you help me?" he asked. Claire met his gaze. "Because you needed it, Your Grace." He opened his mouth to say something else, but the words did not come. His eyes rolled back and he fell forward, and Claire caught him, lowering him gently onto the bed as his breath went deep and slow. She stood there for a moment, her hand on his shoulder, feeling the rise and fall of his chest. From the doorway, Maggie's small voice came, quiet and certain. "He's sleeping now, Mama. The bad stuff makes them sleep." Claire turned and looked at her daughter. "Yes," she said softly. "Yes, it does." And in the silence of the king's chambers, with the fire crackling low and the night pressing cold against the windows, Claire sat down on the stool beside the bed, and she waited. Outside, in the corridor, the shadow had returned. It stood for a moment at the door, watching the light beneath it, and then it moved away into the dark, carrying with it a secret that would not stay hidden for long. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a bed of low orange coals, and the chamber had grown cold around the edges. Claire pulled her shawl tighter about her shoulders and leaned forward, watching the rise and fall of the king's chest beneath the wool blanket. His breathing had steadied, but it was too deep, too slow, like a man swimming far beneath the surface of sleep. She had done what she could. She had turned his head to the side, the way the villain killer had done for old Mercer. When he drank bad ale, She had wiped the cold sweat from his brow with a damp cloth, and she had set a basin of water on the floor beside the bed, close enough to reach in the dark. There was nothing more a washerwoman could do for a king, except stay. Maggie had fallen asleep on the cushioned bench near the window, curled into a small ball with her cheek pressed against her own folded arms. Claire had draped her own spare apron over the girl as a blanket. It was thin, but it was warm enough, and the child had not stirred in nearly an hour. The door to the chamber opened without a knock. Claire rose to her feet at once, her hands folding in front of her. The man who stepped inside was tall and thin, with a silver-streaked beard trimmed close to his jaw. He wore the dark wool robes of the household steward, and his eyes moved quickly across the room before settling on her. "With respect, your grace is unwell," Bartholomew said, though the words were aimed at her, not at the sleeping king. "I came as soon as I heard. It is my duty to see to his comfort." Claire inclined her head. "He is resting, Master Steward." "Resting," the steward repeated the word as though tasting it. He stepped closer to the bed, looking down at Edward's face. His own face revealed nothing, but Claire noticed the way his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the staff he carried. "And how is it that a laundry maid happened to be in the king's corridor at this hour?" She had expected the question. She had been turning it over in her mind since she settled onto the stool. "My daughter could not sleep," she said. "She wandered. She found his grace unwell, and she came for me." "Your daughter?" Bartholomew's gaze drifted to the small shape on the bench. "The chilp think who speaks of drugging." Claire's chest tightened. She kept her voice even. "She is 7, Master Steward. She speaks of what she sees." "And what does she see?" The steward's tone was mild, almost pleasant, but there was a weight beneath it. "She sees a king who has fallen ill, and she names it poison." "That is a peculiar thing for a child to know." Claire met his eyes. She had scrubbed floors and hauled water for 15 years. She had buried her husband. She had raised a daughter alone in a castle that did not care whether she lived or died. She did not look away. "She saw what I saw, Master Steward. A man who could not stand on his own feet. If there is a word for that, I did not teach it to her." The steward regarded her for a long moment. Then he smiled, a thin and careful smile that did not reach his eyes. "Of course, you are loyal. That is good." He moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. "See that his grace rests. I will send the castle physician in the morning." He glanced back at her. "And I will have the kitchen send up a tray for you and the child. You have done your duty tonight. You should not be forgotten." The door closed behind him with a soft click. Claire stood very still for a long time, listening to the sound of his footsteps fading down the corridor. Her hands were trembling, and she pressed them flat against her apron until they stilled. The steward's words had been kind, but the way he had looked at her, the way he had watched her, had felt like a door being quietly shut. She turned back to the bed, and her breath caught. Edward's eyes were open. He lay on his back, his head turned toward her, and his gray eyes were fixed on her face with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He had been awake for some time, she realized. He heard everything. She dropped to her knees beside the bed before she could think. "Your Grace! How long?" His voice was rough, scraped raw from the drug and the sleep. He did not move, but his eyes followed her. "How long have I been here?" "Since before midnight, Your Grace. A few hours." She reached for the cup of water on the table, then hesitated. She did not know if he would accept anything from her hands. "You were given something. Something that made you sleep." "I know what I was given." He said it flatly, without anger. His gaze moved past her to the bench, where Maggie slept, then back. "The girl. She said I was drugged." "Yes, Your Grace." "How did she know?" Claire's throat tightened. This was the question she had hoped would not come so soon. "She has seen it before, Your Grace. In the village. A neighbor drank something he should not have, and he was the same way, dizzy, then asleep, then hard to wake. It was the truth, though not the whole truth." She had not told him the rest. About the healer who had taught Maggie the signs. Edward was silent for a moment, Then he pushed himself up on one elbow, and the movement cost him. His face went pale and he swayed, and Claire reached out without thinking, her hand closing over his arm to steady him. He looked down at her hand, then up at her face. "You saved my life," he said. It was not a question. "I did what anyone would do, Your Grace." "That is not true." His voice was quiet, but there was a weight in it that made her go still. "There are 100 people in this castle who would have let me fall and said nothing. For fear of being blamed. You did not. You caught me. You brought me here. You sat with me all night." He looked at her, and for a moment something flickered in his gray eyes, something that was not suspicion, not command, but something rawer. Why? Claire looked down at her hands, still resting on his arm. She could feel the heat of him through the linen sleeve, the solid weight of him beneath her palm. She thought about her husband, about the man who had gone to war for this king and never come home. She thought about the night she had lain awake, wondering if anyone had held him while he died. She lifted her eyes to Edward's. "Because no one should have to be alone when they are frightened, Your Grace," she said, very softly. "Even a king." The words hung in the air between them. Edward's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he would say something sharp, something that would push her back into her place. But instead, he let out a long, slow breath, and his shoulders sagged a little, as though some string inside him had been cut. "Fetch me the water," he said, his voice quieter now, almost rough. "And then you should sleep. You have done enough." Claire rose and poured the water into the cup. She held it for him while he drank, his hand shaking slightly as he gripped the rim. When he had finished, he lay back against the pillows, his eyes closing. "Maggie?" he said, her name a question. "My daughter, Your Grace. The one who tells the truth." A faint, tired smile touched the corner of his mouth. "That is a rare thing in this castle." Claire did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. She settled back onto the stool, drawing her shawl around her shoulders. The fire had burned lower, and the cold was creeping in again, but she did not mind. She watched the king's face until his breathing evened out into sleep, and then she watched the shadows move across the ceiling, and she thought about the way Bartholomew had looked at her when he said she would not be forgotten. She did not think he had meant it as a kindness. Outside the window, the first pale hint of gray touched the edge of the sky. Dawn was still a long way off, but the night was turning, and somewhere in the dark corridors of the castle, the man who had poured the poison was already planning his next move. Dawn came slowly to Highmore Castle, slipping gray and cold through the slits in the stone walls. The corridors were quiet, the torches burned low, and the servants moved about their duties with the hush of people who knew better than to wake a sleeping king. Claire had not slept. She had left the king's chamber just before first light, when the night watch had come to relieve her and the physician Eldrick had arrived with his leather satchel and his grave, unhurried manner. She had slipped away without a word, down the narrow stairs, through the kitchen yard, back to the small room she shared with Maggie in the servants' quarters. But she had not slept. She had sat on the edge of her cot watching Maggie breathe, and she had thought about the way Edward's hand had closed around her wrist in the dark. It had not been a grip of fear. It had been the grip of a man who had forgotten how to be held. So when the kitchen began to stir, Claire was already there, kneading dough before the first pot of porridge was set over the fire. The kitchen maids gave her odd looks. She was a laundry maid after all, not a cook. But she did not explain. She shaped the dough into small rounds, brushed them with honey from the jar that sat on the high shelf, and slid them into the bread oven at the back. The smell of honey and warm flour filled the kitchen. Maggie appeared at her elbow, rubbing her eyes, her dark hair a tangle of sleep. "Mama," she said, "what are you making?" "Hush," Claire said softly. "It is for someone who needs a kindness today." Maggie considered this. "Can I help?" Claire smiled and pressed a small lump of dough into her daughter's hand. "You can shape this one. Make it round, like the moon." Maggie set to work with fierce concentration, her tongue poking out at the corner of her mouth. Claire watched her for a moment, then turned back to her own task. She pulled a handful of dried earth from the pouch she kept in her apron. Chamomile, a little mint, a sprig of something the old healer in her village had called heart's ease, and crushed them into a small clay pot. She poured hot water over them, covered the pot with a cloth, and set it beside the cooling honey cakes. The physician Eldrick found her an hour later, carrying the tray up the narrow stairs to the king's chambers. "Good morning," he said mildly, falling into step beside her. "You are up early." "I could not sleep," Claire said. Eldrick nodded. He was an old man, with a face like a kind, wrinkled apple, and he had seen enough of castle life to know when not to pry. "The king is awake," he said. "He asked about you." Claire's steps faltered. "About me?" "About the woman who pulled him back from the edge," Eldrick said. "I told him you were a laundry maid named Claire." He said nothing more. "But I have known him long enough to know when he is thinking." They reached the door of the king's chamber. Claire set the tray on a small table by the wall and straightened her apron. "I am not going in," she said. "The physician should attend to the king. I was only—" She hesitated. "I was only bringing something for the morning meal. I will leave it here." Eldrick looked at her, then at the tray, then at her again. There was a small, knowing smile at the corner of his mouth. "Very well," he said. "I will tell him it was left anonymously." "No," Claire said quickly. "Do not tell him anything. Just let him find it. That is enough." Eldrick's smile deepened, but he said nothing more. He took the tray and carried it into the chamber. And Claire turned and walked quickly back down the stairs, her heart beating a little faster than it should have been. She told herself it was nothing. A few honey cakes, a pot of tea, the kind of thing any servant might do for a recovering master. It meant nothing. It was nothing. But when she reached the laundry room and picked up the first heavy sheet, she found herself smiling at the steam rising from the hot water, and she could not quite stop. Edward of House Thornwood was not a man accustomed to sweetness. He had grown up on hard bread and cold water, on the discipline of the training yard and the silence of the war council. Sweetness in his experience was a thing that came with a price. A honeyed word meant a hidden knife. A sweet smile meant a debt to be collected. So when the smell of honey and warm flour drifted through the door of his chamber, he did not trust it. He had been sitting in the high-backed chair by the fire, wrapped in a woolen cloak, his head still heavy with the residue of the night's poison. Eldrick had pronounced him out of danger, but his limbs felt slow, his thoughts thick as mud. He had been staring at the flames, trying to remember the last time he had felt this weak, when the smell reached him. It was not a subtle smell. It was the smell of a kitchen at dawn, of a mother's hands, of something that had no business being in the cold stone halls of Highmoor. On the table by the door, covered by a clean linen cloth, sat a small tray. Under the cloth he found a clay pot of steaming tea, fragrant with chamomile and mint and something else he could not name, and beside it, arranged on a chipped earthenware plate, was a stack of honey cakes, still warm. Edward stared at them for a long moment. "You are not hungry, Your Grace?" Eldrick had asked from the doorway. Edward did not answer. He picked up one of the cakes, felt its warmth against his palm, and brought it to his nose. The smell was dizzying, simple and sweet and utterly without guile. He took a bite. The honey melted on his tongue, and something in his chest loosened, just a little, like a knot that had been tied too tight for too many years. "Who brought this?" he asked, his voice rough. Eldrick's expression was carefully neutral. "It was left by the door, Your Grace. No name." Edward looked at the cake in his hand, then at the door, then back at the cake. He thought of the woman who had pulled him back from the edge, who had held his hand in the dark and told him that no one should face fear alone. He did not say anything. He ate the cake in 3 bites, drank the tea down to the dregs, and when Eldrick left he sat alone in the silence of his chamber, turning the chipped earthenware plate over in his hands. It was nothing, a few honey cakes, a pot of tea, the kind of thing any servant might do. But Edward had not received an anonymous kindness in so long that he had forgotten what it felt like, and he found, to his quiet surprise, that he wanted to know who had sent it. Bartholomew the steward found her in the laundry room, elbow deep in soapy water, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. She did not see him at first. She was scrubbing a linen sheet with a rhythm born of years of practice, her brow furrowed, her lips moving silently, perhaps counting, perhaps praying. The steam rose arousing thought. Her, and the late morning light through the high window caught the edges of her hair where it escaped from her kerchief. "A busy morning," Bartholomew said. Claire startled, nearly dropping the sheet. She turned, saw him standing in the doorway with his hands folded behind his back and his pleasant, unreadable smile, and her stomach tightened. "Steward," she said, dipping her head, "I did not hear you come in." "Clearly." Bartholomew stepped into the room, glancing around at the hanging sheets, the baskets of clean linen, the steaming tubs. "I came to tell you that the physician has confirmed the king is recovering well. Your quick actions last night were noted, Claire." Claire's hands moved automatically, wringing out the sheet. "I only did what anyone would do." "Did you?" Bartholomew's smile did not reach his eyes. "I wonder. The king's enemies would have been pleased to see him fall ill, and yet here you are, scrubbing linen, smelling of soap, and—" He parted, his nostrils flaring. "Honey," Claire's heart gave a hard thump, but she kept her face still. "I am a laundry maid, steward. I smell of soap because I wash clothes. There is no honey in the laundry room." "No," Bartholomew agreed pleasantly. "I am sure there is not." He turned to go, then paused at the door. "The king has asked that you be moved to a chamber nearer his own. For your safety, he says, and for your daughter's." Claire's breath caught. He asked for that? "He did." Bartholomew's voice was mild, but there was something sharp beneath it, like a blade wrapped in silk. "I have arranged it. You and the girl will move to the East Tower this afternoon. I trust you will find it comfortable." He left before she could respond, his footsteps fading down the corridor. Claire stood in the steam, her hands ripping the wet linen so hard her knuckles turned white. A chamber nearer the king, for her safety, and for Maggie's. She did not know if it was a kindness or a cage. She only knew that Bartholomew had looked at her like a man measuring a threat, and that she and her daughter were now firmly within his sight. That evening, as she gathered her few belongings and climbed the stairs to the East Tower, she thought of Edward's hand closing around her wrist in the dark. She thought of the honey cakes she had left by his door, anonymous and warm. And she thought with a small, stubborn hope that she did not quite dare to name, that perhaps she had done something right after all. The East Tower room was small but dry, with a narrow window that looked out over the inner bailey. Claire set down their bundle of belongings, 2 worn dresses, a spare shift for Maggie, and the little cloth pouch of dried flowers she had gathered from the kitchen garden. Maggie stood at the window, pressing her nose against the cold glass. "Mama, look! There are horses!" Claire came to stand beside her, resting a hand on her daughter's shoulder. Below, a groom led 2 steaming horses across the cobblestones toward the stables. The afternoon light was thin and pale, the kind of light that came just before the autumn turned to winter. "It's a fine room," Claire said quietly, more to herself than to the child. "A fine room. And close to the king." She did not say what she truly thought, that the closeness felt less like a gift and more like a test. That Bartholomew's smile had been too smooth, his eyes too watchful, but she had learned long ago not to speak her fears aloud in front of the child. Maggie tugged at her sleeve. "Mama, can I go down to the yard? The hounds are out. I heard them barking." Claire hesitated. The castle was vast, and she did not yet know which corners were safe. But the yard was open, full of grooms and kitchen girls and off-duty soldiers. Safer, perhaps, than being shut away in a strange tower room. "Stay within sight of the well," she said, "and do not speak to the men in armor." Maggie was already halfway out the door. "But why, Mama?" "Because I said so." The door swung shut behind her, and Claire stood alone in the quiet room, listening to the sound of her daughter's footsteps pattering down the stone stairs. The yard was alive with the bustle of late afternoon. Maggie found a spot near the kennels, where 3 shaggy hounds lay sprawled in the last warm patch of sunlight. She crouched down, holding out a scrap of bread she had tucked into her pocket that morning. The largest hound, a grey-muzzled old thing named Bramble, lifted his head, sniffed once, and ambled over to accept the offering with great dignity. Maggie giggled and scratched behind his ears. "You're a good dog," she said. "A very good dog." "Are you old? You look old. My grandpa was old. Before he went to the sky?" A kitchen boy passing with a bucket of slops paused. "Your grandpa? He a soldier?" Maggie shook her head, still scratching Bramble's ears. No, he lived in the village, by the mill. He used to tell me stories about the river. The kitchen boy shrugged and moved on, uninterested, but another pair of ears had caught the exchange. A thin, sharp-faced man in the grey livery of the steward's office, who had been standing in the shadow of the kennel wall, ostensibly checking a ledger. He did not move. He merely tilted his head, listening. Maggie, oblivious, continued to talk to the dog. Grandpa said there was a bad winter once, and the well water turned funny. He said Pete drank it and got dizzy, like they'd been drinking strong ale. One old man, she paused, frowning at the memory. One old man fell down and couldn't get up. The village healer said it was the bad water. He made him drink a bitter tea and stay in bed for 3 days. She looked up at the hound, her brow furrowed. He got better, though. Grandpa said the healer knew what to do because he'd seen it before. Bramble thumped his tail, uninterested in the story, but happy for the attention. In the shadow of the wall, the thin-faced man closed his ledger and walked away, his steps quiet and purposeful. Claire had just finished hanging their few garments on the wooden pegs when a knock came at the door. She opened it to find a young page, red-faced and breathless. "Mistress Claire? The king requests your presence in the east corridor, if it pleases you." Her heart gave a nervous lurch. "Now?" "Now, mistress." She smoothed her apron, tucked a stray strand of hair beneath her cap, and followed the boy down the winding stairs. The east corridor was long and lined with tapestries, the stone cold beneath her feet. At the far end, near a tall arched window, stood Edward. He was dressed in a simple tunic of dark wool, no cloak, no armor. His gray eyes looked tired, but there was a sharpness in them that had not been there the night before, a clarity, a returning strength. He did not turn as she approached. He was looking out the window at the yard below. "Your Grace," she said, curtsying. "You have a daughter," he said, without turning. 7 years old, curious, kind to animals. Claire's throat tightened. "Yes, Your Grace. I watched her from this window. She was talking to the old hound." He paused. She said something about a village healer. About bad water. Claire's hands were things, but I kept her voice steady. "Maggie's grandfather lived by the mill, Your Grace. When she was very young, there was a bad winter. The well water turned. An old man fell ill, and the village healer recognized the signs. Edward turned then, and his gray eyes met hers. There was something in them she could not name, not suspicion, not anger, something quieter. Your daughter saw a man poisoned by bad water," he said slowly, "and she recognized the same signs in me." "Yes, Your Grace." He was silent for a long moment. The wind rattled the window glass, and somewhere below a dog barked. "He saved my life," he said at last, "because a child remembered a story her grandfather told her." Claire bowed her head. "She is a clever child, Your Grace. She sees things the rest of us miss." Edward made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. "That she does." He reached into his pocket and drew out something small, wrapped in a scrap of cloth. He held it out to her, and she took it, puzzled. It was a piece of honey cake. Her honey cake. The one she had left by his door that morning, now half-eaten and wrapped with care. "I found this by my door," he said, his voice low. "I ate it. It was good. I wanted to thank whoever made it." Claire's fingers closed around the cloth. She did not look up. "Take care, Your Grace," she said softly. "The kitchen has a good baker." She turned and walked back down the corridor before he could say another word. Her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he could hear it. That evening, Bartholomew paid a visit to the East Tower room. He stood in the doorway, his hands clasped behind his back, his smile as smooth as polished stone. "Are you settling in well, Mistress Claire? The king has been most generous with you. The room is comfortable." "Velas, Master Bartholomew, thank you." He nodded, his eyes drifting past her to where Maggie sat on the floor, playing with a small wooden horse. "I heard your daughter was speaking to the groomsboy today. Something about a village healer? An interesting tale." Claire felt a cold trickle run down her spine. "It is only a story, Master Bartholomew. Children say all manner of things." "Indeed they do," he said pleasantly. "Indeed they do." He left without another word. But as he descended the stairs, he paused at the landing and spoke to the thin-faced man waiting in the shadows. "Keep an eye on the child," he said quietly, "and find out who taught her about poisoned water." The thin-faced man nodded and slipped away into the dark. Upstairs, Claire sat on the edge of the bed, watching Maggie play with the wooden horse, and tried very hard not to be afraid. The morning came in pale gold, the kind of late autumn light that made even the gray stone of Highmoor look warm. Claire had meant to keep her head down and her hands busy, but the East Tower room had no wash basin of its own, and so she found herself crossing the inner courtyard just after the bell for tear, a bundle of laundry under one arm and Maggie's small hand in her other. Maggie skipped ahead, tugging at her mother's fingers. "Mama, can I go see the hounds? The gray one likes me." "I know it does. After I've hung the linens," Claire said, shifting the bundle. "And mind you don't." But Maggie had already spotted the pack of hunting dogs lounging by the kennel door, and she pulled free with a squeal of delight, her small boots scattering gravel. Claire sighed, a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth despite herself. She watched her daughter crouch down, offering her palm to the gray hound, which padded over and Maggie thinked at her fingers with lazy affection. It was then that Claire noticed the figure standing at the far end of the courtyard. Edward of House Thornwood, Alpha King of the Northern Marches, stood in the shadow of the colonnade, one shoulder propped against a stone pillar. He was not wearing his leather armor today, only a dark wool tunic and a heavy cloak, and he held a folded parchment in one hand that he seemed to have forgotten about entirely. His gray eyes were fixed on Maggie, on the way she laughed as the hound nuzzled her palm, on the way she spoke to the animal in a soft, serious voice. Claire's breath caught. She had not spoken to him since that morning in his chambers, when he had looked at her with suspicion, and she had answered him with a steadiness she had not truly felt. Now he was standing there, watching her daughter, and something in her chest tightened with a fear she could not name. She hurried across the courtyard, meaning to scoop Maggie up and retreat to the laundry yard, but she was too late. "Mama!" Maggie called, waving. "Lama, come see! The gray one has a scar on his ear, just like the king's eyebrow." Claire's face went hot. She grabbed Maggie's hand and curtsied hastily in the direction of the colonnade, keeping her eyes down. "Your Grace, forgive her. She means no offense." There was a pause. Then, to her surprise, a low sound that might have been a chuckle. "She is not wrong," Edward said. He stepped out of the shadow, and Claire saw that he was walking without a limp now, though he favored his left leg just slightly. The hound earned that scar the same way I did. In a fight it had no business picking. Maggie's eyes went wide. "You were in a fight, sir?" "A few," Edward said. "A long time ago." Claire tried to pull her daughter away again, think Maggie was not finished. She had spotted the loose lace on her own boot, and she crouched down, fumbling at it with clumsy 7-year-old fingers. "Mama, it came undone again. You tied it too loose this morning." Claire opened her mouth to answer, but Edward moved first. He crossed the courtyard in 3 long strides, and before Claire could say a word, he had lowered himself to one knee in front of Maggie. The Alpha King of Thornwood, the man who had put down 3 rebellions and held the northern border against the raiders, knelt in the gravel and took the little girl's boot in his broad, scarred hands. Maggie stared at him, frozen. "Sir, what are you doing?" "Fixing your lace," Edward said. His voice was gruff, but his fingers were careful as he worked the leather cord through the eyelets. "My sister used to tie her laces like this. Always came undone by midday. I learned the trick of it." Claire stood rooted to the ground, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he could hear it. She watched his hands, hands that had held a sword in battle, hands that had signed death warrants and sealed treaties, gently loop the lace into a neat bow. He patted Maggie's boot when he was done. "There," he said. "That will hold." Maggie looked down at her boot, then back up at his face. She tilted her head, studying him with the unnerving directness of a child. "You're not as scary as people say," she announced. Edward went very still. Claire's stomach dropped. "Maggie—" "No, let her speak," Edward said quietly. He was still kneeling, his face at Maggie's level. "What do people say about me, little one?" Maggie considered the question with the gravity of a judge. "They say you are cold and that you do not smile." She paused. "But you smiled just now." When you said the hound got a scar the same way you did. That was a smile. Edward did not answer. He looked at Maggie for a long moment, then slowly got to his feet. When he turned to Claire, his expression was unreadable, but something in his eyes had shifted, a softening she had not seen before. "Your daughter is very honest," he said. "She is too honest," Claire said, her voice strained. "She will learn to hold her tongue." "I hope she does not." The words hung in the air between them. Claire looked up at him, startled, and found that he was looking at her with an attention that made her feel suddenly, dangerously visible. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for the honey cakes. They were the best I have had in years." Claire felt the heat rise to her cheeks. She had not expected him to say it so plainly, not here, in the open courtyard where anyone might hear. It was nothing, Your Grace. A small thing." "It was not a small thing." Edward's voice was low. "No one has made me anything by hand in a long time, not without wanting something in return." Claire did not know what to say. She looked down at her hands, at the calluses and the chapped knuckles, and tried to find words that would not sound like a plea. "It is only honey and flour, Your Grace. Any cook could have done it." "No," he said, "they could not." Maggie, who had been watching the exchange with bright, curious eyes, tugged at Claire's skirt. "Mama, you make the best honey cakes in the whole castle. The cook said so." Claire hushed her, but Edward's mouth curved into something that was almost a smile. "The cook said so, did she? Then I am in good company." He looked down at Maggie again, and then back at Claire. There was a question in his gray eyes, a tentative reaching that she did not quite know how to answer. "Walk with me a little," he said. "There is something I have not spoken of in a long time, and I find myself wanting to say it to someone who will not use it against me." Claire hesitated. Every instinct told her to refuse, to gather Maggie and retreat to the safety of the laundry yard, where she was just another servant and no one looked at her twice. But there was something in his voice, a tiredness, a loneliness, that she recognized. She nodded. "A little way, Your Grace. I must get to the linens." Edward fell into step beside her, and Maggie skipped ahead, chasing the grey hound across the grass. They walked in silence for a few paces, the gravel crunching under their boots. "I had a man once," Edward said at last, his voice careful, deliberate. "A steward, before Bartholomew. He served me for 8 years. I trusted him with my life." Claire kept her eyes on the path ahead. "What happened to him?" "He tried to take that life." Edward's voice was flat. "He slipped something into my wine. On a night much like this one, he thought I would not notice the taste. He thought I would not wake." Claire felt a coldness settle in her stomach. "You woke?" "I woke." Edward's jaw tightened. "He was gone by morning. I never saw him again. But I learned something that night that I have not forgotten since." He stopped walking, and Claire stopped with him. He turned to face her, and for a moment she saw something raw in his grey eyes. A wound that had never fully closed. "I learned that trust is a gift, and that I had been giving it away too cheaply." He paused. "I have not given it to anyone since." Claire looked at him, at the scar on his brow and the lines around his eyes, and she understood suddenly why he had seemed so cold, so untouchable. He was not cold, he was afraid. "Maggie does not know fear," she said quietly. "She does not know how to be afraid of you. That is why she said what she said." Edward looked down at the little girl who was now rolling on the grass with the grey hound, laughing. Something passed across his face, wonder, perhaps, or longing. "No," he said softly. "I suppose she does not." They stood there in the pale autumn sunlight, the Alpha King and the laundry maid, watching a child play with a dog. It was not a grand moment, not a declaration or a vow, but something had shifted between them, something fragile and tentative, like the first crack in a wall that had stood for 10 years. When Claire finally gathered Maggie and hurried off to the laundry yard, she looked back once over her shoulder. Edward was still standing where she had left him, watching her go, and for the first time in a very long while, she did not feel afraid. The letter arrived on the 5th morning after the garden, folded tight and sealed with plain wax. No crest, no name. It was slipped beneath the door of the Alpha King's study sometime before dawn, and by the time Edward found it, the ink had dried into a neat, poisonous little script. It read in careful, unhurried letters, "Your Grace, the maid who tends your wine is the same woman who tended your bed. Ask her what she poured into your cup on the night you fell ill. She knows more than she has told." Edward read it 3 times. The first time his jaw tightened. The second, his hand went still. The third, he set it down on the desk and stared at the window for a long, unblinking moment. Claire. The laundry maid with the dry hands and the quiet voice who had fed him honey cakes and sat by his bedside while he retched into a basin. The woman who had looked at him in the pale autumn light and said, "You do not to carry it alone." He wanted to crumple the letter and throw it into the fire. He wanted to believe it was nothing but spite. But the words had taken root, and a man who had been poisoned once knew better than to ignore a whisper of treason. He sent for her that afternoon. Claire came with her hands still damp from the wash-tub, a strand of chestnut hair escaping her kerchief. She had not been given time to change, and her apron was streaked with soap and water. When she saw the letter on the desk, she stopped 2 paces from the door and did not come closer. "You sent for me, Your Grace," she said. Not a question. She had learned that a summons from the Alpha King was never a question. Edward did not invite her to sit. He stood behind the oak desk, his gray eyes fixed on her face, and he read the letter aloud in a voice that gave nothing away. When he finished, the silence in the study was so thick that Claire could hear her own heartbeat. "This letter claims you had a hand in what was done to me," he said. "It claims you know more about my wine than you have told." Claire looked at him. For a long moment she did not speak, her hands, still damp, folded together in front of her apron, and she held his gaze without flinching. "I do not know who wrote that letter, Your Grace," she said. "But if you believe it, then there is nothing I can say that will change your mind." "That is not an answer. It is the only answer I have." Edward's hand moved to the hilt of his sword, not a threat but a habit, a man reaching for something solid when the ground beneath him shifted. "You were in my chambers the night I fell ill. You sat by my bed. You brought me water and herbs. You told me I had been drugged." "I did. And yet you did not tell me who did it." Claire's jaw tightened. Because I did not know. I still do not know. I saw you stagger, I saw your eyes lose focus, and I did what any person would do for another who was failing. I helped." "Any person," Edward repeated slowly, "or a person with a reason to stay close to the king?" The words hung in the air like a blade. Claire felt the sting of them, cold and precise. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes, hurt perhaps, or disappointment, but she did not look away. "If I wanted to harm you, Your Grace," she said quietly, "I would not have sat by your bedside and held a basin for you while you were sick. I would not have stayed up all night, afraid you would not wake. I would not have let my daughter near you, if I meant you harm." At the mention of Maggie, something in Edward's face shifted. The hard line of his jaw softened, just barely, and he looked down at the letter on the desk as if seeing it for the first time. "Your daughter," he said, "the girl with the hound." "Yes, she told me I was not tired, that I was drugged." "Yes." Edward was silent for a long moment. Then he picked up the letter and folded it, slowly, deliberately, and slid it into a drawer of his desk. "You may go," he said. Claire did not move. She stood there, her damp hands folded, her eyes steady, and for a moment she looked as if she wanted to say something more. But then she pressed her lips together, dipped her head in a small, formal bow, and turned toward the door. At the threshold she paused. "Take care, Your Grace," she said, her voice softer now. "There are people in this castle who would see you fall. I am not one of them." She left the door open behind her. Edward stood at the window for a long time after she was gone, watching the autumn light fade over the pine forest. He did not believe the letter. He did not, he told himself, but doubt was a poison too, slower and more insidious than any draught, and it had already begun to work its way into his blood. By evening, word had spread through the castle that the laundry maid had been questioned in the king's study. Servants whispered in the corridors. Kitchens went quiet when Claire walked through. The looks she received were not hostile, but they were wary, watchful, the way people look at someone who has been marked. Claire felt the weight of it as she gathered Maggie from the kitchen and walked her back to the cramped little room they shared above the stables. Maggie chattered about the hound and the stable boy and the goose that had chased her across the yard, and Claire nodded and smiled at the right places, but her mind was elsewhere. "He was angry with you, Mama," Maggie said suddenly, looking up at her with those two perceptive eyes. "The king, he was angry." Claire knelt down and smoothed her daughter's hair. "He was worried, love. Worried people sometimes look angry." "Why was he worried? Because someone told him something false about me." Maggie considered this for a moment, her small brow furrowed. Then she said, "That's silly. You wouldn't do a bad thing." Claire's throat tightened. She pulled her daughter into a quick, fierce hug. "No," she murmured into the child's hair, "I wouldn't. But some people are afraid of what they do not understand." That night, Claire lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling of the little room, listening to Maggie's soft breathing. She thought about the letter, about the cold look in Edward's eyes, about the way his hand had moved to his sword. She had told him the truth, and she did not think he had believed her. And somewhere in the castle, Bartholomew the steward smiled into his cup of wine, watching the seeds he had planted begin to grow. The room they gave Claire was at the top of the east tower, a narrow chamber with a single window that looked out over the bailey. It was not a prison, the steward had said with his smooth smile, merely a precaution until the matter of the letter could be properly examined. Claire had not argued. She had gathered her few belongings, taken Maggie by the hand, and walked up the winding stairs without a word. Maggie had not understood why they were moving. She had asked twice whether they were going on a journey, and Claire had said no, not a journey, just a change of rooms for a little while. The child had accepted this with the easy trust of the very young, and had spent the first afternoon pressing her face to the window, counting the crows in the courtyard below. On the second day, a kitchen maid came to fetch Maggie for work. Claire's heart clenched, but she smoothed her apron and knelt to straighten her daughter's collar. "Be good," she said. "Mind the cooks, and if anyone asks you anything—" "About the letter?" Maggie asked, too quick. Claire's hands stilled. "Who told you about the letter?" "Nobody. I heard the maids talking." Maggie tilted her head. "They said the king thinks you wrote something bad, but I told them you wouldn't." Claire pulled her close, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "You are too clever for your own good, my girl." Maggie squirmed free and ran down the stairs, her small boots clattering on the stone. Claire stood at the top, watching until the child disappeared around the bend, and then she went back into the narrow room and sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap. She had not seen Edward since the day of the questioning. She did know whether that was a good sign or a bad one. 3 nights passed. On the 4th, Edward sat alone in his study, a single candle burning low. The letter lay open on the desk before him, its neat, careful handwriting accusing Claire of conspiring to poison him. He had read it so many times that he could recite it from memory. The accusation was precise, the details were specific, and yet something gnawed at him. He pushed back his chair and crossed to the iron chest where he kept the old records of the household. The lock was stiff. He had not opened it in months. Inside were ledgers, accounts, and letters from a dozen years of rule. He pulled out a bundle of correspondence from the steward's office, tied with a length of twine. He untied the twine and spread the papers across the desk. Bartholomew's hand was familiar to him, the careful, rounded letters of a man who prided himself on order. Edward set the anonymous letter beside a page from the steward's own accounts. He bent closer, holding the candle near. The pens were different, of course. The anonymous letter had been written with a finer nib, the strokes lighter, more deliberate. But there was a sameness to the way the letters were formed, the way the capital T was crossed, the way the G looped slightly to the left. Edward straightened. He stared at the 2 papers for a long time, and then he blew out the candle and sat in the dark, thinking. On the 5th day, a report reached him from the kitchens. The steward had sent word that the maid's daughter was settling in well. A cheerful little thing, quick to laugh, endlessly curious. The cooks had taken a liking to her. She had asked why the king ate alone every night, and someone had said, "Because he does not trust anyone." And the child had replied, "That's silly. Everyone needs someone to sit with." Edward heard this second-hand, from a groom who had heard it from a scullery maid, and he did not know why it stayed with him. He found himself walking toward the kitchens that evening, not with any purpose, just walking. The corridor was quiet. Cooks were finishing the evening meal. He heard a child's laugh, bright and unguarded, and he paused at the doorway. Maggie was sitting on an upturned barrel, swinging her legs, a half-eaten honey cake in one hand. She was talking to one of the kitchen cats, a grey tom that sat washing its face by the hearth. "Do you think the king is lonely?" she asked the cat. "I think he is. He has that look, like my dad used to have, before he went to the wars." Edward stepped back from the doorway, his hand pressed flat against the stone wall. He stood there for a long moment, and then he turned and walked back to his study without saying a word to anyone. That night, he climbed the East Tower stairs. He did not know what he meant to say. He only knew that he could not lie awake one more hour staring at the ceiling, thinking of a woman who had saved his life and a child who had seen through him in a single glance. The door at the top of the stairs was closed. A sliver of candlelight showed beneath it. He raised his hand to knock, and then he stopped. He could hear Claire's voice, low and soothing, singing something soft. A lullaby, perhaps. The kind of song a mother sings when she thinks no one is listening. Edward let his hand fall. He stood there, in the dark, listening to the song. It was a simple thing, a tune he had heard in the village markets, about a shepherd who lost his way and found his way home by the light of a single star. When the song ended, he heard Maggie's sleepy voice. "Mama, is the king going to send us away?"
"No," Claire said. "He is not." "How do you know?" A pause, then quieter. "Because he is not a cruel man. He is only a tired one." Edward turned and walked back down the stairs. His boots made no sound on the stone. In his study, he sat down and took out a fresh sheet of parchment. He dipped his pen and began to write. Not a letter to anyone, but a list of dates. Dates of the steward's movements. Dates of the 2 nights he had been drugged. Dates of the times the wine had tasted strange. The pattern was there, if he looked for it. Bartholomew had been present on every occasion. Bartholomew had poured the wine. Bartholomew had urged him to drink. Edward set down the pen. He looked at the list for a long time, and then he folded it carefully and tucked it inside his doublet close to his heart. He did not sleep that night, but for the first time in many days, he knew what he had to do. The 5th night after the 2nd cup of poison, Bartholomew made his move. Edward saw it coming the way a man sees a storm gather over the hills, not in a single flash, but in the slow, patient darkening of the sky. The steward had grown quieter in the halls. His bows were deeper, his smiles more frequent, and his eyes never quite met the king's. To any other man it might have passed for deference. To Edward, it was the stillness before the blade falls. He was in his study when the knock came, soft and measured, the knock of a man who wished to be heard but not remembered. "Enter!" Bartholomew stepped in, bearing a silver tray. On it sat a single goblet, dark wine gleaming in the candlelight, and a small plate of honeyed cakes. "With respect, your grace," he said, setting the tray down. "You have not eaten since morning. The kitchens thought you might take
something warm before the night grows long." Edward looked at the goblet, then at the steward's hands, which were steady, well kept, the hands of a man who had never chopped wood or scrubbed a floor. "You are kind," Edward said, and his voice betrayed nothing. "Leave it." Bartholomew hesitated. A flicker, no more. "Shall I pour, your grace?" "No." The steward bowed and withdrew, but Edward saw it, the tiny tightening at the corner of the mouth, the way the fingers curled, just slightly, toward the palm, a man who had been cheated of his moment. Edward waited until the footsteps faded. Then he rose, took the goblet, and crossed to the window. The moon was high over Thornwood, silvering the pines. He held the wine up to the light, swirled it once, and sniffed. The scent was wrong, too sweet, with an undertone of something bitter, like crushed walnut shells. He did not drink. Instead, he carried the goblet to the far corner of the study, where an old iron-bound chest sat beneath a tapestry of the thome it bore. He unlocked it, lifted out a sealed leather pouch, and placed the goblet inside, untouched, intact, the dark liquid still swaying. Then he locked the chest again and tucked the key into his belt, next to the folded parchment with the dates. The trap was set. Now he had only to wait for the traitor to spring it. He might have gone to his chambers then, and slept, or tried to sleep, which for a man of his years and wounds amounted to the same thing,
but his feet carried him instead up the winding stairs of the East Tower. Past the guard who bowed and stepped aside, to a heavy oak door with a small barred window, Claire was awake. He could see her through the bars, sitting on the edge of the narrow bed, a candle burning low beside her.
She was sewing, always sewing, it seemed, mending a small shift that was not her own, with the careful, patient stitches of a woman who had learned to make do with little. Her hair had come loose from its kerchief and fell in a dark wave over her shoulder. She looked up when his shadow fell across the door, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Your Grace," she said at last, and her voice was steady, though her hands had stilled on the cloth. "It is late. I know." He stood on the far side of the door, one hand flat against the wood. "I came to tell you something." "Then tell me." He paused. The words were harder than he had expected. He had commanded armies, faced down rebellious lords, walked into rooms where every man held a knife and none held his gaze. But this small confession, made to a laundress through a locked door, was harder than all of it. "Bartholomew has tried again," he said. "Tonight, in my wine." He heard her sharp intake of breath. The needle clattered against the bed frame. "You did not—" "I did not drink it." He pressed his palm harder against the wood, as if he could reach her through it. "I have it saved. Sealed. I will not need it if all goes as I intend." "Your Grace," Edward. The word came out rough, and he was surprised by it. "I would have you call me by my name, here, where no one can hear. I would have you know that I believe you. I have believed you since the night you caught me in that corridor, when I was too far gone to stand, and you did not run." Silence. He could hear her breathing, slow and careful, the way a woman breathes when she is holding back tears. "I am not afraid for myself," she said at last, quietly. "I am afraid for Maggie. She is in the kitchens, and Bartholomew has set one of his men to watch her. I have seen him there, by the pantry door. He'd look at her the way a guard looks at a child." Edward closed his eyes. The anger that rose in him was cold, not hot, the old familiar fury of a man who has learned to wait, to plan, to strike only when the blow will land. "She'll not be harmed, I give you my word." "Your word?" Claire's voice was soft, almost wondering. "You give me your word?" "Yes." He heard the rustle of her skirts as she rose and crossed to the door. Her shadow fell through the bars, close enough that he could see the curve of her cheek, the dark sweep of her lashes. She did not open the door, but she placed her hand on the wood, on the other side of his, so that only the thickness of the oak lay between their palms. "Then I will trust you," she said. "I will trust you, Edward, but if anything happens to my daughter, it will not. Promise me." "I promise." He said it without hesitation, the way a man swears an oath he means to keep. "On my father's sword, and on the honor of my house, she will not be harmed." A long moment passed. Then she drew her hand back, and he heard her step away from the door. "You should go," she said, her voice steadier now. "He will wonder where you are, and you have a trap to spring." Edward nodded, though she could not see it. He turned and had taken 2 steps down the stairs when her voice came again, softer this time, almost carried away by the draught. "Edward." He stopped. "Take care of yourself as well," she said. "The kingdom needs its king. And Maggie. Maggie has begun to ask about you, why you are sad, why you walk alone at night." A pause. She said you look like her father did, before he went to the wars. Edward felt something crack open in his chest. A fissure he had not known was there. He did not trust himself to speak. He only raised a hand. To scream. She could not see it and continued down the stairs. In the great hall, the candles had burned low. Bartholomew was waiting near the hearth, his face arranged in a mask of concern. "Your Grace," he said, rising, "you look pale. Did the wine not agree with you?" Edward looked at him, and for a moment the 2 men stood face to face, the firelight flickering between them. The steward's eyes were steady, guileless, the eyes of a man who had spent a lifetime learning to lie without blinking. The wine was strong, Edward said. I saved it for later. He saw the flicker again, the tiny, almost invisible tightening at the corner of the mouth. Very good, Your Grace, Bartholomew said, and bowed. I hope the night brings you rest. Edward walked past him without another word, but as he climbed the stairs to his own chambers, his hand drifted to his chest, where the list of dates lay folded against his heart. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow the trap springs. The great hall of Highmoor was cold that morning. Despite the fires burning in both hearths, the household had been summoned at dawn, and the servants stood in uneasy clusters along the walls, their eyes darting toward the dais where Edward sat in the high chair of the Alpha King. Claire stood near the back, her hands clasped tightly before her. They had brought her down from the tower an hour ago, without explanation. Beside her, a kitchen maid held Maggie by the shoulders, but the girl squirmed free the moment she saw her mother and pressed herself against Claire's skirt. "Mama, what is happening?" Maggie whispered. Claire did not answer. Her eyes were fixed on Edward, on the quiet stillness of his face, and on Bartholomew, who stood to the right of the dais, with his hands folded in a pose of patient service. Edward rose. Think. The hall fell silent. "Bartholomew," he said, and his voice carried to every corner of the room. "Step forward." The steward's face did not change. He stepped forward with the same measured tread he had used for 20 years of service. "Your Grace," he said, bowing, "how may I be of assistance?" Edward did not return the bow. He held up his hand, and in it was a silver cup, sealed with wax and tied with a length of cord. "Do you recognize this cup?" he asked. Bartholomew's eyes flickered. "Just once," then he smiled. "It is one of the hall's cups, Your Grace. There are many like it." "There are not," Edward said quietly. "This one has a hairline crack in the rim. I noticed it 2 nights ago, when you pressed it into my hands and told me the wine was strong." He paused. "The wine left in it has been tasted by the castle physician. He confirms what I suspected. It was laced with nightshade." A murmur rippled through the hall. Bartholomew's smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes shifted, like a snake coiling before it strikes. "Your Grace, this is a grave accusation," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "May I ask who has put such a tale in your ear? I fear there are those who wish to see me fall." Edward reached into his tunic and drew out a folded parchment. "This is a letter," he said, "found in the quarters of the Maid Claire. It accuses her of conspiring to poison me. The handwriting is careful, deliberate, trying to look like a woman's hand." He looked up. But the physician who examined it also compared it to the records of the household accounts. "The hand is yours, Bartholomew. The same slope of the letters, the same pressure on the pen. You wrote it to frame an innocent woman." The hall went very quiet. Claire felt Maggie's small hand tighten around her. "Thinkers." Bartholomew's face had gone pale, but he still fought. "This is sophistry, Your Grace. Anyone could imitate my hand. I am being framed." "You were seen," Edward said, and his voice dropped low, almost gentle. "The night you slipped the poison into Claire's sewing basket, one of the kitchen boys was fetching water from the courtyard. He saw you come out of the tower stair with something in your hand. He told me this morning. When I asked him directly..." Bartholomew's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, the mask cracked. Edward took a step down from the dais, close enough that the steward could see the gray of his eyes. "You poisoned me 3 times, he said. "The first time, I was sick for a week, and the physician called it a fever. The second time, you were more careful. The third time, I was ready." He held up the sealed cup. "I did not drink it. I poured it into this cup and sealed it, because I wanted you to think your plan had worked. I wanted you to grow bold enough to make a mistake." Bartholomew's hands had begun to tremble. "Your Grace, I have served you faithfully for 20 years. "You served yourself," Edward said. "You have been selling iron to the Eastern lords behind my back. I have the accounts, I have the letters, I have the dates, Bartholomew. Every single one." He pulled a second parchment from his tunic. the list of dates he had kept folded against his heart. He read them aloud, one by one, and with each date a little more color drained from the steward's face. The first night of autumn, the wine was drugged. The third night, the second attempt. The night before last, the third. 3 times you tried to kill me, and 3 times you planned to blame a woman who has never done you any harm. Edward's voice cracked on the last words, and Claire saw his hand tighten on the parchment. "Why?" he asked, and it was not the voice of a king, but of a man who had been betrayed. "I trusted you, Bartholomew. I trusted you more than I have trusted anyone since—" He stopped, and the hall held its breath. Bartholomew did not answer. He stood as if turned to stone. Edward turned to the guards at the door. "Take him," he said. "He is stripped of his title, his lands, and his name. He is banished from Thornwood, forever. If he is found within the borders of this territory again, he will be hanged." The guards moved forward. Bartholomew did not resist. As they dragged him past Claire, he looked at her, and for a moment his eyes held something that might have been regret, or might have been hate. Then he was gone, and the great doors swung shut behind him. The hall was silent. No one moved. Edward stood alone on the dais, his shoulders bowed as if under a great weight. He looked at the crowd of servants, at the faces that had watched him be poisoned and betrayed, and behind them all, he saw Claire. He raised a hand. "Leave us," he said. "All of you. The maid, Claire, and her daughter, stay." The hall emptied in a rustle of skirts and boots. The doors closed, and they were alone. Edward on the dais, Claire near the back wall, and Maggie pressed against her mother's side. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Edward sat down heavily on the edge of the dais, and he looked old. Not old in years. He was only 39. But old in the way a man looks when he has carried a weight for too long. 10 years ago, he said, his voice rough, I trusted a man the way I trusted Bartholomew. He was my squire, my closest companion. He had grown up beside me, fought beside me, bled beside me. He paused. He put poison in my wine, exactly the way Bartholomew did. I was sick for a month. I nearly died. When I recovered, he was gone, and I never found out why. Claire took a step forward. "Edward," she said softly. He looked up at her, and there was something raw in his gray eyes, something he had never shown another living soul. "I have been alone since that day," he said. "Not because no one was near me, but because I could not trust anyone to be near me. Every servant, every adviser, every hand that brought me food or poured my wine, I watched them all. I waited for them to betray me, the way he did." He laughed, a small, bitter sound, and then a little girl in a dark corridor told me I was drugged, and I did not know whether to believe her or to have her thrown in the cells. Maggie stepped out from behind her mother's skirt. She walked up to the dais, small and serious, and looked up at the Alpha King of Thornwood, with eyes that held no fear at all. "You're not bad," she said. "You're just tired." Edward stared at her. And then, slowly, something broke behind his eyes. Not the wall, but the weight behind it. He slid off the edge of the dais and knelt on the stone floor, bringing himself to her level. "Your mother told me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "that you asked why I was sad, why I always said tired." Maggie nodded. "Mama says sad people need friends, not medicine." Edward looked up at Claire, who had come to stand beside her daughter. Her hands were clasped in front of her, but her eyes were soft, and there were tears standing in them. "I was wrong," he said, and the words seemed to cost him something. "To doubt you, to doubt her, to think that the only people near me were there to hurt me." He looked at Claire. "You saved my life, twice, and I repaid you with suspicion and a locked door." Claire shook her head. "You repaid me with trust," she said. "Last night, behind that door, you asked me to call you by your name. That was worth more than any apology." Edward reached out slowly and took Maggie's small hand in his own. It was the first time he had touched another person voluntarily in years. "I would like to be your friend," he said to her, "if you will have me." Maggie considered this with the gravity of a 7-year-old who had seen too much and understood more. Then she smiled. "You can have my biscuit at supper," she said, "if you promise not to be sad anymore." Edward laughed. It was a rusty, unpracticed sound, as if the muscles of his face had forgotten how to shape it, but it was real. "Come here," he said, and he opened his arms. Maggie stepped into them without hesitation, and the Alpha King of Thornwood, the man who had trusted no one for 10 years, held a child's hand and felt something thaw in his chest. Claire watched them, and the tears spilled over her cheeks. She did not wipe them away. Edward looked up at her over Maggie's head, and for the first time his gray eyes were not guarded. "Thank you," he said, "for the honey cakes, for the night watch, for the door." He paused. "For not giving up on me." Claire knelt down beside him so that the three of them were level, the king, the maid, and the child. "I will never give up on you," she said. "That is not who I am." The fire crackled in the hearth, and outside the high windows the first flakes of snow began to fall. The snow fell steadily over Highmoor by the time the great hall had emptied. The courtiers had filed out in uneasy silence, each man and woman carrying the weight of what they had witnessed, the Alpha King's voice breaking, the steward's disgrace, and the strange sight of their stern lord kneeling on the stone floor beside a maid and her child. Edward did not move for a long moment. He sat with his back against the hearth, Maggie still nestled against his side, her small fingers curled loosely around his thumb. The fire had burned low, and the shadows stretched long across the flagstones. "Mama," Maggie said drowsily, "I think the king is warm now." Claire smiled and reached out to brush a stray strand of hair from her daughter's forehead. "I think he is, Swaydard, I think he is." Edward turned his head, and for a moment the old guarded look flickered in his grey eyes, but it faded as quickly as it had come. He looked at Claire properly, the way he had not allowed himself to look at anyone in 10 years. "There is something I want to show you," he said quietly. "Both of you." He rose carefully, lifting Maggie into his arms as if she weighed no more than a bundle of wool. She giggled and looped her arms around his neck, and Claire watched the way his hands that had held swords and signed death warrants, cradled her daughter with a tenderness that stole her breath. They followed him through the winding corridors of Highmoor, past the tapestry of the Thornwood boar, past the tall windows where the snow now clung to the glass. He stopped before a heavy oak door at the end of the east wing, a door Claire had never seen opened in all her years of service. Edward shifted Maggie to one arm and drew a key from beneath his tunic. The lock turned with a soft click, and the door swung inward. The room beyond was small, but warm. A fire already crackled in the hearth, and the embers cast a golden glow over a bed piled with thick wool blankets, a carved wooden chest, and a low table set with bread, cheese, and a jug of warm milk. The air smelled of dried lavender and pine. Maggie's eyes went wide. "Is this for us, Mama?" Claire's throat tightened. She looked at Edward, who stood in the doorway with an expression she could not quite name, half hope, half fear, as if he expected her to refuse. "The east wing is the warmest in winter," he said, his voice carefully even. "The chimney draws well, and the windows face south. I thought you might prefer it to the servants' quarters." "Edward," Claire said softly, and the sound of his name, his true name, unguarded, seemed to startle him. "I know it is not much," he said quickly, "but I can have more furniture brought up, and there is a small alcove where Maggie could keep her things. And I thought—" He stopped, and a faint flush crept up his neck. "I thought you might like a place of your own, where no one can question your right to be here." Claire stepped past him into the room. She ran her hand over the wool blanket, felt the warmth of the fire, and when she turned back, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "It is beautiful," she said. "It is more than beautiful, it is—" She pressed a hand to her chest. "I do not know what to say." Edward set Maggie down gently, and the girl immediately ran to the window, pressing her nose against the glass to watch the snow. He crossed the room to stand beside Claire, close enough that she could smell the wood smoke and leather that clung to his clothes. "You do not have to say anything," he said quietly. "You saved my life, Claire. You and your daughter. You gave me back something I thought I had lost forever. A room with a warm hearth is the least I can offer." He reached into the folds of his cloak and drew out a long, narrow object wrapped in oilcloth. Claire watched as he unwrapped it slowly, revealing a sword, opening but beautifully kept, its pommel worked in the shape of a thorned rose. "This sword has been in my family for 4 generations," Edward said. "It was my father's, and his father's before him. It has seen battles and treaties and the long, cold winters of the north." He looked down at it, and his jaw tightened. "I have no children of my own, no heir to pass it to, and I have spent 10 years convinced that no one would ever be worthy of it." He knelt down, and Maggie turned from the window to look at him with curious eyes. "Maggie," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I would like you to have this. Not to fight with, not yet anyway, but to keep. To remember that there is always someone who trusts you, even when the world seems cold." Maggie looked at the sword, then at her mother. Claire nodded, her hands pressed together against her lips. "Really?" Maggie whispered. "Really," Edward said. "And if you would like, I can teach you to hold it properly. When you are a little older, I think you would make a fine guardian of Thornwood." Maggie threw her arms around his neck, and Edward let out a startled laugh that caught in his throat. He held her tightly, his eyes closed, and Claire saw the faint glisten of tears on his weathered cheek. "When I was a boy," he said, his voice muffled against Maggie's hair, "my mother used to say that a house is not a home until someone you love has fallen asleep by the fire. I never understood that, not until tonight." Claire knelt down beside them and laid her hand gently on his arm. "Then let us make it so," she said softly. Later, after the bread and cheese had been eaten and the milk had grown cold in its jug, they settled by the fire, Edward in the high-backed chair, Claire on the low stool beside him, and Maggie curled in her mother's lap, her eyes already growing heavy. The snow continued to fall beyond the windows, blanketing the courtyard in white. The castle was quiet, the servants had gone to their beds, and the guards stood watch in the towers, and for the first time in 10 years, the Alpha King of Thornwood felt the weight in his chest ease. "Claire," he said quietly so as not to wake the child. "Yes?" "I meant what I said earlier, about the East Wing and about—" he hesitated, "about wanting you to stay. Not as a servant. I want to name you Steward of Highmoor, to oversee the household, the kitchens, the accounts. I trust no one else with them." Claire looked at him, and the firelight danced in her brown eyes. "And who would manage the laundry?" Edward almost smiled. "I would find someone else, someone who does not know how to brew a honey cake that makes a king forget his troubles." She laughed, a low, warm sound that seemed to fill the room. "Then I accept your grace, on one condition." "Name it." "That you come to supper with us. Every evening, not as the Alpha King, but as Edward." She paused. "Maggie would like that. And so would I." Edward looked at her for a long moment, and then slowly, as if testing the weight of the words, he nodded. "Every evening," he said. "I give you my word." Maggie stirred in her mother's lap and murmured something sleepy and unintelligible. Then she added, more clearly, "But why, Mama?" Claire and Edward exchanged a glance, and for the first time they both smiled, the easy, unguarded smile of 2 people who had found something worth keeping. "Because, sweetheart," Claire said, stroking her daughter's hair, "sometimes the coldest places are the ones that need the warmest fires." The fire crackled, the snow fell, and in the East Wing of Highmoor, a king, a Maid, and a little girl sat together by the hearth, not as ruler and servant, but as the beginning of a family. Outside, the winter wind howled against the stones, but inside there was only warmth. The Alpha King spent 10 years building walls of ice to keep the world out, only to realize that the strongest fortress isn't made of stone. It is built by a quiet hearth, a gentle touch, and a little girl's brave truth. Have you ever found love and warmth in the most unexpected of places? Pull up a chair to the fire, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. Until next time.